Hi, welcome to another sew along. Today we are going to recreate a pattern that has been out of print for a while, but we've been seeing it a lot on Facebook and other social media. So I wanted to try to show you how to make a Becky from a Lillian. Lillian has been around a long time. We've recently had it reprinted and there have been a few changes, not many. And so whether you have the old Lillian or the new, you'll be fine. I have just printed mine off from the PDF, but it also comes in tissue. And so you will have your Lillian pattern pieces. And if it's the old Lillian, you will just have a front and a back. If it's the newer Lillian, you'll also have a back lining. So even if that's just 3 pieces. So once you have gotten your patterns out, get some tissue paper. So on the blog with the sew along is a sheet that you can print out that has instruction on it, and it has several charts for measurements. And one of those measurements is the new length that we're going to use. And so when you go to trace your pattern pieces, you don't have to trace them all the way down, but refer to that chart for your particular size, and you'll measure from the high point on the shoulder down to the new cutting line. So just when you're tracing, refer to that, and you only need to trace that far, maybe just a little bit further to give you some extra room. So you will have your pattern pieces to trace, and then some of the things you need to include when you're tracing your pattern is the center back. The new reprinted Lillian on the back piece also has a fold line and then a facing. So I don't know if you're familiar with some of our new patterns. If you are, we often, when it's a bodice that's lined or a dress that's lined, we have a wraparound facing, and it just looks a little nicer, but either one is fine. And so you will need to mark the center back, the fold line, and then you will also have buttonholes that you need to just go ahead and mark. And depending on what happens near the end of the bottom of your new cutting line, you don't want a buttonhole right at the very bottom. So don't put one there. And you may need to readjust them a little bit. You'll want maybe about 3 inches of space between the bottom of your new top and your last buttonhole. So 3 inches, 3.5 to, kind of depends on the size you're making. The smaller the size, the smaller the distance from the bottom buttonhole to the bottom of the top. And so let's see what else. Oh, we're going to talk about the slit too. So after you've traced and gotten your new cutting line at the bottom, you need to be able to mark where those cute slits are going to go, and then you'll have a bow at the top of the slit. So go to the bottom of the front. They are only in the front, not the back, and measure from the edge, the side edge, over to the center front. And your measurement's going to be different. Mine is 7.5. So once you get that measurement, multiply that by 2. So for me, that made it 15. And then divide that number by 3. So it was easy. Mine is 5. And so then from the side seam, or this cut line at the side, measure over whatever that distance is. For me, it was 5. And put a dot there. And then you're actually going to draw a line. And again, there will be some suggestions on your instruction sheet on how long your slit should be, and it's going to depend on your size. Mine was 3 inches, so just perpendicular from the bottom of your new cutting line, just draw up whatever that number is for your size. And also that line is parallel to the center front, if that helps too. Once you've done that, then measure over 1/2 inch from that line, and then measure over 1/2 inch on the other side of that line. So now you have 2 marks that are 1 inch apart. Once you have done that, then just connect that dot with the top of the slit line. And the line you're drawing right now is actually a stitching line. It's not a cutting line. And so you may even want to, instead of putting a solid line, you may want to make little dashes just to remind you that you're not going to be cutting on that line. You're going to be sewing on that line. So let's see. I think that's everything. So get everything together. Get your patterns traced and shortened. And then go ahead and cut out your fabric. You'll need your lining as well as your outer fabric. And also you can refer to the sheet for that because you won't need as much as the regular Lillian. And if you want to kind of think ahead to what you might put this top with, usually in the Becky pattern there was also either bloomers or shorts, but we have bloomers now. We have bloomers that are in the Franny pattern for little ones, and then the Parker shorts are just great everyday shorts to use. They're fun and easy and quick to put together, but or you can just put it with a pair of jeans too. It's very cute. So get started, and I'll get my things cut out too, and we'll be back to start stitching. Okay, I hope you got everything cut out. On your back piece, up at the top here, mark, and it can just be like a little 1/4 inch line, but mark the center back and also the fold line, and do that on both sides. I've gone ahead and done my shoulder seams, and I'll do the shoulder seams to the lining in just a little bit. And also, if you didn't mark your V's, go ahead and mark your V's for your slit. I marked them on my lining just because I knew they would show up better than on the garment fabric. And so when I sew my V's, I'll sew with the lining side up. So the next thing I'm going to do a little pressing and press these seams open. And then just for a little pop of color, I am going to stitch piping around the neckline and around each armhole. So I will start and stop my piping just past the fold line, and that's the line that's closest to the cut edge. And so what I want to do is, there's my fold line, so my piping is going to be maybe about 1/4 inch past that, and I'm actually going to put a pin here. So I will just ease my piping on and off just past that fold line, maybe about 1/4 inch. After I've stitched it on, I'll go back and pull maybe about 1/2 inch of the cord out so that it'll still be a smooth and not a real bulky seam right there. So I'm going to do that all around the neck edge and around the armholes. I just thought it would add a little bit of interest and just a pop of color there. So get your shoulder seams done and pressed open, and then if you want to do something similar to what I'm doing, by all means do that, and then we'll be ready to continue with the rest of the construction. This will go really fast. Well, I just thought I was going to pipe my armholes. Actually, I did pipe one and then realized I didn't have enough for the other. So I'm just going to move on and not pipe the armholes, but I did have to take the piping off of one side. So I've gotten the piping stitched onto the neckline, and like I said, I went back then and trimmed about 1/2 inch of cording out of there, so this will lay much flatter. So you can see how I just eased on and eased off the fabric right there. So I can actually trim that little bit off and keep it more even with the neckline. So I've got my shoulder seams done on my lining too. So the next thing is to do the back seams, just the back seams attaching the lining to the fabric. Now, if you're using the original Lillian pattern, then just hold up for a minute and we'll get right back to you. So I'm just going to stitch. This won't line up down here, so I'm just going to stitch this one long seam and then on the other side as well. Okay, now I have got my seams stitched that attach my outer fabric to my lining along the back. And so now I've taken my back lining and matched it up with the armhole. And now I'm pressing what is the fold line of your facing. So you can see how it just gives you a nice finished look. So now I'm ready to put my top right sides together. And again, I'll be matching the armholes just to be sure that I have it matched correctly. And also the sides, the shoulder seams will match now too. So if you are working with the original Lillian, you will be sewing up the back, around the neck, and back down the back on the other side. Then you will be sewing each armhole right sides together. If you've already done this step on the new Lillian and have your facing stitched to your lining, then now you are ready to also stitch the neckline and each armhole. I'm using a new notion, or it's new to me anyway. I think in the quilting world, people have been talking about these wool, felted wool pressing mats for a while now. And so this is really my first time to use it with a project. And the idea behind it is this wool is so thick, it's about ½ an inch thick, and it's felted wool, so it's wool that has been shrunk. And so when you press a hot iron on whatever you're ironing, seams that you're pressing open, it's like you're pressing from both sides, because the wool heats up and then it releases that heat back into the fabric. And I can tell a difference. One of the things I also noticed, I was trying to press a crease out of a piece of fabric earlier, and in the past I feel like I would have to have made more than one effort to get that crease gone. And when I had the fabric on the pressing wool pad, it just flattened out right away. So I think there is something to it. Okay, so I'm going to sew around the neck and the armholes. After you've done that, clip and trim your seams. So I've got those seams done, trimmed and clipped. So now we're ready to work on the bottom part of this Becky. So this is the back, and I have it pinned with right sides together. So across the back, you just stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Same way on the other side. Then on the front, that's where your V's are for the slit. So you're going to pin those. I'm going to put 2 or 3 pins in the area where the V is, so your fabric doesn't shift. And for this seam, because of this V and how close we are going to be clipping at the top, it really would be best if you turn your stitch length down to 1.5, and that will make it less likely for you to end up with a hole where your slit is. So now to stitch this, the bottom of the front, you're going to do a lot of pivoting. So I'm going to put just a few more pins across the bottom. So what you're going to do is you're going to start at one side. You're not doing any side seams here, but just down at the corner, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you will stitch until you get to the line of your V, the first line. That's when you're going to stop and pivot, and you'll stitch up your drawn line till you get to the top. Then you'll stop and pivot and take 1 stitch, and then you will pivot again and stitch back down. But don't stitch all the way to the bottom edge of the fabric. Stop 1/4 inch from the bottom edge. Then stitch all the way across till you get to the next slit or the next V. You'll stop and pivot and go up that V, stop and pivot, take 1 stitch, pivot, go back down. Again, don't go all the way to the bottom edge of the fabric. Stop 1/4 inch from the bottom edge, and then stitch across until you get to that bottom corner. So let's get that done, and then we'll talk about trimming and turning everything right side out. So I've got everything stitched. Now for trimming. Start by just trimming straight up the V. And without clipping any stitches, get as close to the point as you can. Then go back down now where you have a corner here, and you'll clip across the corner. You can trim these seams a little bit too. So now I'm going to clip across this corner. And if you want, you can actually trim your seam allowance on each side of the stitching for the V. So it won't be quite so bulky. So continue that trimming. Then you get to the next V. Cut straight up to the very top. And then clip your corners, trim your seams a little. Okay, I'll clean up my mess a little bit. So I've gone ahead and trimmed the back too. So now we are ready to turn everything right side out. So these backs, they will all come through each shoulder seam. will come through the other side. So you got to reach in here where your side seams are still open. You're going to need a point turner when you get everything turned right side out. You've got lots of corners to neaten up. Okay, I'm going to grab my point turner, get these points nice and sharp, and get everything pressed. Then we'll be ready for the side seam, both side seams. Okay, I've got everything pressed. Now we're going to do the side seams. So with right sides together, separate the lining from the outer fabric on both the front and the back. Start by matching the underarm seam. And then go down and match the seam at the bottom where the lining and the fabric are sewn together. And then put a few pins along this side seam. Then what I want you to do is go ahead and work your way up the lining. It'll probably be about 4 inches. On the bigger sizes, maybe 5 inches. And then go where the lining starts at the other end here. And match those lining edges for a few inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing, starting right here, and then I'm going to keep stitching, continue stitching all the way around till I get as far as I can on the lining on this side. So you'll still have a hole in the lining, but you will have all of your side seam as well as most of the lining side seam stitched. Here I've got all my pins out and my threads clipped. Turn right side out. So now from the side that isn't stitched yet, you can just reach your hand in between the lining and the fabric and go over here where you still have an opening in the lining at that side seam, and just pinch the fabrics together right there, pull them out. And then I've got about 4 or 5 inches left there to stitch. And then you'll be able to just pull that back out, the unfinished side seam, and press, and you'll be ready to do the other side seam. So now we're ready for the second side seam. You'll be doing it just the same way, except because the other side seam is now sewn, you won't be able to reach in there to get that last little section of lining stitched. So you'll need to whip that down by hand, or actually you can sew it on the sewing machine if you prefer, and after I get mine stitched, I'll show you how to do that. But in the meantime, go ahead and stitch this side seam just like you did the other one, starting a little bit in the lining and then ending a little bit in the lining. So I'm going to do that, but I also wanted to talk about these ties that we're going to put above the little slits in front. And this is a bias tape maker, and this is the 1/2 inch. So what you do is you start with a strip of fabric that is 1 inch, and it can be biased, but it doesn't have to be biased. And I cut mine just with the grain instead of the bias. And then if you will starch this lightly, I feel like that really helps get a good result. And I'm going to move my mat out of the way for this. So to do this, you're going to, I like to go ahead and just cut one end at an angle. I think it's easier to get it started that way. And then you can kind of push it in, and if you feel like you can't get it to come through the other side yet, or the other end, just take a pin. There's an area right here where you can actually put the pin down on the fabric, and then you can push it on through. So once you do that, what this does is it folds the 2 edges of the strip so that those edges meet in the middle. And then as you pull, just keep your iron right there near the end of your bias tape maker. And it's a great way to get this folded without burning your fingers. But if you don't have one, what we're doing is we're just taking the 2 edges and pressing them to the center of this 1 inch strip. It's really nice because it does the work for you. So this strip is about 28 inches long, and that'll give me 2 strips 14 inches long each for my ties. So now what I'm going to do is take my strip that's now a 1/2 inch wide and fold it again. And that's how wide the ties will be, is 1/4 inch. So after you get this all pressed, then just top stitch close to those 2 folded edges. And then we'll come back and talk about how to attach the ties and finish up this Becky top. So I've got the second side seam now, and I'm left with that opening that you can whip stitch down, or you can just fold those seam allowances to the inside 1/4 inch, and then put those 2 folded edges just right next to each other, and then just straight stitch the opening closed by just stitching really close to those folded edges. So that's a real secure way to do it too. But whichever way you do it, be sure you do it, because every little girl will think that is a hidden pocket, and they'll put all kinds of little treasures in there for their mama to find when they're doing the laundry. So that's how I would do that, is just with a little straight stitch. And then for your ties, what I've done is gone ahead and tied mine before I tack it down. And then just with a small zigzag, maybe 1.5 for the width, and actually 0 for the length. So you're just tacking. And then what I did was I tacked it in the middle, and then also I tied a knot in each end. So even though these ends are not finished, they are not going to fray. If you're at all concerned about it, you can put a little bit of fray check there. But if you put that knot right at the very end, then there really isn't any fabric there to fray. So after you tie the knot, if there's a little bit of fabric sticking out, you could go back and then just clip that fabric off. If you have used a bias band instead of just one strip cut on the grain, then the bias band isn't going to fray with it being cut on the bias. So after you get your tie and you're happy with it, then you will just attach it right here at the top of the slit. And I tacked it in 3 places. I went ahead and tacked it right there where the knot is, and then I pulled my tails down just a little bit, and then just on each one tacked those down too, so they don't pop up. So this one's already tacked down, so you can see it really stays put. So I've got buttonholes to do, and buttons to sew on, and I'll be done with the top. I was going to show you what I'm going to put with this Becky top. And this is just, these are Parker pants. These are the shorts. And what I did is I took just a straight strip, 1 inch wide, of my top fabric, and then I used the same bias tape maker, excuse me, and then I didn't fold it the second time. I just left it so that now it's a 1/2 inch with a fold on each edge, and now I'm just top stitching that in place at the bottom of the shorts. So I went ahead and pressed where the hem will be, and then so I'm placing this 1 inch up from the edge of the hem. I just think it'll be really cute and a bright summer outfit. So I'll get these finished, and then we'll be right back. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this Becky class. Now you know how easy it is to take a simple Lillian and make it into something that's out of print. I think it's really sweet. You can pair it with some shorts, or even just a little skirt would be cute too. Looking forward to seeing your creations, and I'll see you next time.